Okay, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Zami Tinashe Hemingway. My pronouns are Zami, he, and him. And I'm the Capacity Building Assistance or CBA Gender Affirming Project Manager with Denver Prevention Training Center. Welcome to our last community of practice for this year on gender affirming care. So excited, and thank you all for being consistent and joining us every single month. If everyone could please change their name to the first and last name that you registered under so that we can take attendance, that would be great. In addition to changing your name, if you can include your pronouns so that we can honor everyone here, that would be appreciated as well. So thank you again for coming to our COP today. I want to briefly share more information for folks who may be joining us for the first time, just in case. As part of the Denver PTC CBA funding, we are providing technical assistance in the West region to CDC directly funded community-based organizations and their clinical partners to address social determinants of health, gender affirming and integrated services, and delivery of status neutral services for transgender and gender expansive people. We work closely with 15 jurisdictions in the West to collaboratively provide services for transgender people in alignment with ending the HIV epidemic initiative. If you are not a directly funded organization, we were able to help and would be more than happy to continue to help you in the future around TA support. You can send me an email at zami.hemingway@dhha.org for additional information. Thank you all again for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to Ty Edward Few before we turn it over to Jordan.
Good day, everyone. My name is Ty Edward Few. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Learning and Development Manager of the Denver PTC. Specifically, I work with the Capacity Building Assistance Unit. It has been my pleasure over the last almost 2 years for us to have these communities of practice. And this is our last community of practice specifically focused on transgender and non-binary communities. So I wanted to do some thank yous. I wanted to thank Zami for managing this program. Give it up for Zami. Let's give Zami some applause. Zami has done a great job. I also want to thank each of the identity consultants, of which Jordan is one of them. So we have Jordan Bliss, we have Callan Smith, we have Miss Jai Smith, we have Nevaeh Burton Anderson, and Dr. Riley Smith as well. They have done an excellent job for us delivering high quality communities of practices. And I just wanted to thank everyone. Finally, I wanted to thank the one person who, without her constant effort and help, we would not have any of these communities of practice. I want to thank our producer, Misty Gutierrez. I know she's going to kill me for calling her into the space like this, but thank you, Misty, for all of your work that you've done making this possible. And with that, over to Jordan.
Thanks so much, Ty, and thank you to all of you for joining us today and for joining us for the last couple of years with these COPs. My name is Jordan Bliss, as Ty mentioned. My pronouns are he and him. I'm very excited to be part of today's final COP, focusing on trans and non-binary veterans. I'm an identity consultant here at the Denver Prevention Training Center, and I identify as a queer transgender man. I served in the United States Air Force as a senior airman working as a fuel systems journeyman on the KC-135R Stratotanker, which is an in-air refueling aircraft from 2011 until 2015. This topic is pretty personal to me because of the role that the military played in my life. But that said, my experiences are just that, my own. And so like any group, transgender and non-binary veterans are not a monolith. And I hope you'll come to understand some more of the nuances of our community through today's COP. We have reserved some time at the end for questions, but especially since we've got a smaller group today, please feel free to unmute at any time if you want to ask a question or place it in the chat box, and we'll address things as we go too. As we're going along today, I'll ask that you all contribute your thoughts and reflections or things that you're learning into the chat, and we'll kind of be pausing periodically throughout the COP to read some of the thoughts that you come up with and invite you to share and discuss more with the group if you're so inclined. Sorry, could we go to the next couple slides here? Perfect, thank you. Real quick, legal disclaimer. This presentation and its information is intended for educational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice for any particular situation. No attorney-client relationship is formed between the attendees and presenter of this publication simply by attending this program or by referencing its materials. Next slide, please. So today's learning objectives. The first one is to identify the unique unique health, mental health, and social challenges faced by transgender and non-binary veterans and their health impact. The second is to identify strategies and resources that community-based organizations and health departments can implement to increase their ability to provide status-neutral services to transgender and non-binary veterans. We'll achieve these objectives by hearing anecdotes from trans and non-binary veterans directly and covering veteran-specific topics such as military sexual trauma and moral injury, as well as by giving you several opportunities to engage with the material and your peers throughout the COP. My hope is to create dialogue that allows you to think intentionally about how this information relates to you in your specific roles and organizations. Next slide, please. So to get us started, let's start out with some trivia questions to gauge our collective knowledge. The first question, and you should have a poll popping up here, is what percentage of the general U.S. population currently serves or has served in a branch of the U.S. Armed Forces? Option A, 5.2%, option B, 8.8%, C, 10.7%, D, 12.6%. Cool. Thank you so much for responding to the poll question. I'll publish. Oh, I think Misty's on it. So we've got answers a little bit all over the board, with the most chosen answer being C, 10.7%, which is correct. 10.7% of the general population serves or has served in the U.S. Armed Forces. Could we go to our next slide, please? Our next question is what percentage of transgender or non-binary individuals are currently serving or have served in a branch of the U.S. Armed Forces? Option A, 5%, option B, 12%, option C, 18%, and option D, 21%. Great. So we've got a lot of option A, 5%, which would put us at about half of the general population rate. The correct answer is D, 21%, which puts transgender and non-binary people at about twice the rate of the general population. And there's some research that indicates that number is even higher. I always like to kind of make the point that regardless of why open trans service, or that the reason why open trans service was so important, regardless of political views on the U.S. military, is because it was and is the single largest employer of transgender and non-binary people in the entire world right now. Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, and here I'm just going to ask you to kind of rate your own comfortability with this topic. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable are you with your knowledge of veteran-specific needs and resources? Option 1, not at all comfortable. 2, somewhat comfortable. 3, comfortable. 4, very comfortable. 5, extremely comfortable. Awesome. Thank you so much. So we've got, it seems like a lot of folks who are relatively new to this topic, and that's great. I'm hoping that for those of you that aren't feeling confident in your knowledge of this just yet, I'm hoping that by the end of the day, you'll be more comfortable navigating your relationships with transgender and non-binary veterans. If we could skip next slide, please. I am going to play a real quick clip.
His first week in office, President Biden formally lifted his predecessor's ban on transgender people serving
Are you all able? Sorry, I just want to make sure everyone's able to see and hear. Okay, great.
in the U.S. military. Tonight, we hear from those who continue to serve, even as some top military leaders wanted them gone. And we ask the question, 1 decade after the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, is military service in this country now finally LGBT blind? Here's Devin Dwyer.
Navy Petty Officer First Class Brock Stone takes pride in his family and his fight.
I'm really big about kind of jumping in there and doing what needs to be done.
Stone's a highly trained cyber analyst at the forefront of evolving threats to national security.
I am here today because I want to remain a part of my family.
And in 2017, he joined an ACLU lawsuit against President Trump to allow transgender service members like him to keep doing their jobs.
I went to Afghanistan, I did all these things. I mean, what does that tell me? That tells me I'm not welcome. That tells me that I am not respected as myself.
The Pentagon under Trump said transgender people could only serve if they effectively suppressed their identity, assuming the gender role of their assigned sex at birth.
We became an endangered species. There weren't going to be any more of us. No one new could come out. No one new could get in.
Those that stayed describe a psychological toll.
The biggest myth is that we're something other than an ordinary sailor who is just here to do a job.
Late last month, President Joe Biden ended the Trump policy, starting a new era of open service in the U.S. military. But now trans service members and their allies are wondering how quickly tolerance will take hold in the ranks and whether the policy of inclusion will be permanent.
I'm not worried about it being able to be done. It's a question of if that senior generation can start to embrace this in a principle-centered way. I think it'll move along.
Retired General James Cartwright, former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, says there are lessons to be learned in the decades since gays and lesbians began serving openly.
You were being asked to live a lie. And that was the ticking time bomb that brought us to where we were when we came to the repeal.
In 2010 and 2011, Cartwright helped lay the groundwork for repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell over concerns from some of his peers.
And assimilating openly homosexual Marines into the tightly woven fabric of our combat units has strong potential for disruption at the small unit level.
In your view, was any of that borne out?
The studies were all conclusive that one, there was no operational impact. In fact, it was just the opposite. Now, to say that there weren't issues, incidents, no, that would be wrong. There were incidents around, but to say that it had operational impact turned out to not be a case. It was a non-issue there.
Okay, Misty, if you wouldn't mind putting the slideshow back up. Thank you very much. And then next slide, please. So after watching that clip, I'm just curious if there was anything that came up for you all. If so, feel free to please unmute and or place your answer into the chat box. Got a hand from Ms. Dry here.
It just is reminding me of how much that rhetoric was happening in the early 2010s. And how that conversation was everywhere, that like this is going to be devastating to our country, it's going to be devastating all these pieces. And so it's really interesting to me to think about how the rhetoric is so similar and what we see happen again. It's almost like the same narrative is being churned out every time. And I honestly, like after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed and knowing so many people who have now been in the military, I was like, oh yeah, it's the same rhetoric.
Yeah, I very much agree. It's cycled through and it's tired and we're still having the same conversations, but hopefully the banner of progress is continuing to move forward. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'd like to keep the discussion going. Misty, if you wouldn't mind moving to our next slide. And I'd like to ask you all, what comes to mind when you picture a veteran? And with that, what gender is the veteran? How old is that veteran? What types of challenges do you envision veterans having? Feel free to either unmute or put some of those answers into the chat box.
And Jordan, I will read the chat for you, so you don't have to worry about that.
Thank you so much.
White men who are Republican and conservative.
Yeah.
Jordan, I tend to think of people, men of color from America's inner cities who went off during Vietnam is who I think about.
Yeah. So I think the common thread here so far is male veterans. I don't think over 50, so older. Ms. Jai, is your hand?
Yeah, I think about not knowing any younger veterans, so like over 50, retirement age, experiencing disability and homelessness, and almost always men, or if they are women, then the assumption that they're going to be butch women or like masculinized women.
Yeah, definitely. Stuart, did you have your hand up as well?
Yeah, I did. And yeah, my comment about white men who are probably Republican and conservative, just the general population, I feel like there is this social means of like, I have to make myself small. I'm certainly not going to come out as a gay man. Certainly wouldn't if I were transgendered or even bringing that up. So amongst that population that I perceive with veterans, there's that attitude like, I better be quiet.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What sorts of challenges, when you think of veteran health needs, what sorts of things come to mind?
I think, Jordan, for me, it's dealing with PTSD and then trying to get into the VA for getting an appointment.
Yeah.
Jordan, for me, I think of just all the horrible stories that I've heard about poor care in the VA hospital. I grew up by VA hospital, and there were just horrible stories that people just weren't properly cared for.
Well, thank you all for those responses. I think, especially on the last one, the common thread here seems to be mental health challenges, and I think that's right. I think it's pretty common knowledge that veterans, both transgender and cisgender, disproportionately experience high levels of challenges with mental health. And I think usually when people think about military service related trauma and mental health, they're often thinking about combat trauma, or which is trauma that results from being an active participant in combat. Could we go to the next slide, please? Perfect, thank you. So the US has been involved in some form of military conflict for the vast majority of our 246-year history. In recent years, the conflicts in the Middle East have exposed many US service members to all sorts of traumatic experiences, from physical injuries, such as losing limbs, to the grief of losing friends, to the lasting mental scars that being in a daily state of hyperarousal can take. Media has long glorified the combat experiences of white, cisgender, heterosexual infantry veterans by painting them as fearless warriors and morally unimpeachable heroes. For example, in media such as Forrest Gump or Saving Private Ryan. But the reality is that even for cisgender, white, heterosexual infantry veterans, war is as anything but glorious. And so even though society has grown more conscious in recent years, of some experiences associated with veterans, such as PTSD and the need for things like veteran suicide prevention, there's still a huge gap that many of you I mentioned in terms of practically meeting veterans' needs, even for majority identity veterans. So for minority identity veterans, such as women, people who are LGBTQ+, or Black, Indigenous people of color, and for non-combat veterans, the traumas that they experience in service can often feel unrecognized and therefore unimportant. I bring this up not to diminish the experiences of those who have experienced or participated in severe and traumatizing violence, but ultimately to achieve the best care outcomes for all veterans, we must uncouple the subconscious associations that we make between words like veterans and PTSD and combat in order to recognize that military trauma exposure can really come in a variety of forms. And so if we could go to the next slide, to assist in that uncoupling, I want to just provide some basic definitions for each of those words. 38 USC 101(2) defines the term veteran as, quote, a person who has served in the active military, naval, or air service and who is discharged or released therefrom under conditions other than dishonorable. Combat veterans are defined as veterans who have served, I'm sorry, next slide. Combat veterans are defined as veterans who have served on active duty in a theater of combat operations in recent memory, places like Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a psychiatric disorder that may occur in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event. PTSD symptoms usually start after the traumatic event, but they may not appear until months or years later. Symptoms also may come and go over several years. And lastly, to differentiate from post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress, or PTS, is defined as symptoms that someone may experience after witnessing or going through a traumatic event. PTS is a normal short-term set of symptoms that present after the traumatic event. Though they can be temporarily distressing, they are typically short-lived and do not cause prolonged significant effects in one's life. PTS is not a disorder, and having PTS symptoms does not always mean that someone will go on to receive a PTSD diagnosis. Okay, so that was a lot of talking. Does anyone have any questions about these definitions or anything else that we've covered at this point?
Yeah. Jordan, I just saw something on the news the other morning about transgender veterans who had got a non-honorable discharge are now getting honorable. Right. So that was a lot of work to make that happen, correct?
Yes. So, kind of looking back at the history of LGBT service members, a lot of folks were kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, including trans people. Even though Don't Ask, Don't Tell pertained to sexual orientation, a lot of trans people kind of got swept up into that mess. And were discharged. And so there have been a lot of efforts and legislation passed to grant discharge upgrades for folks who were kicked out because they were outed as being gay or trans or whatever it may be. So folks are, if that was the reason for discharge, they are eligible now to have those things upgraded, which really makes a difference in terms of eligibility for benefits, which is absolutely huge. So thank you for that question. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move into a discussion a little bit more into a discussion on post-traumatic stress disorder. While there are some transgender and non-binary veterans who have experienced combat trauma or combat-related PTSD, many others experience trauma directly caused by their fellow service members or the U.S. military's policy and culture. Further, even those veterans who have encountered combat trauma are not precluded from also experiencing other forms of service-related trauma too that result in PTSD or PTS symptoms. For many who have worked with or have personal relationships with veterans who have PTS symptoms, we may have noticed that they experience a broad range of symptoms such as irritability, intrusive memories, trouble concentrating, being jumpy, feeling unable to trust or emotionally connect, poor memory, altered sex drive and function, or trouble enjoying leisure. Since not all people who experience PTS will go on to develop PTSD, it's important to recognize that not all veterans or even people at large who suffer from PTSD are combat veterans, and not all combat veterans develop PTSD. One common source of trauma exposure that develops into military-related PTSD is called military sexual trauma. If we could move to the next slide, or MST. MST is defined by the Department of Veterans Affairs as, quote, a physical assault of a sexual nature, battery of a sexual nature, or sexual harassment which occurred while the veteran was serving on active duty. MSA is another form of trauma. MSA is another form of trauma, and it is more narrowly defined to only include penetrative acts of sexual assault, and therefore does not include sexual harassment or other types of physical assault. In addition to the trauma that creates that sexual violence can take on anyone, MST can create unique challenges because in the military, because it inherently occurs within an individual's workplace. And as a result, there might be a heightened power dynamic between the victim and the perpetrator. For example, a military training instructor assaulting a trainee, or a higher ranking supervisor assaulting a junior troop, et cetera. And those sorts of that sort of power dynamic and kind of inability to separate work from personal can really affect folks' ability to function at work or even their career progression. Next slide, please. Rates of MST among VA outpatients are at approximately 20% for women and 1% for men. Well, the general rate of MST is around 6% for cisgender veterans. Research puts the MST rate for transgender veterans at 15%. Even more disturbingly, the most recent study on this issue found that 17.2% of transgender veterans reported MSA. There isn't just one single actionable factor as to why there are such disparities in sexual violence towards transgender and non-binary veterans. But limited research acknowledges the role of the military's hypermasculine culture and discrimination against gender nonconformity, particularly against those who are perceived as male while serving. One relevant study found that, quote, the military can be a setting in which expressions of aggressive masculine behaviors may contribute to both discrimination towards gender nonconformity and high rates of sexual assault experienced by transgender individuals during their service. Can we go to the next slide, please? And we'll move into a discussion question here. So thinking about what this means for you all, how do you think that the things we've discussed so far today might affect transgender and non-binary veterans' relationships with the civilian institutions that you're a part of, knowing that we're about twice as likely or more to serve in the general population, and that there are heightened, I think unsurprisingly, heightened rates of violence. We've talked specifically about sexual violence, but that kind of bears out across the data on just kind of generalized experiences with discrimination as well. Surprised that MST isn't significantly higher for men too. I think so. If I can speculate a bit on that, I think that has to do somewhat with underreporting as well. Because we only know what folks are willing to report. And I think as someone correctly identified early in this presentation, veterans, I think overall tend to be a little bit more closed off, especially cisgender men, in terms of maybe their willingness to identify as a victim of assault. And so I think that you are right that is a low number. And I don't personally believe that that's a particularly actually accurate number of where that rate falls for men. Ms. Jai.
In thinking about this question and also thinking about I think the stereotype of veterans being older, I think about how it might be difficult for trans veterans who served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell or earlier, or even most recently, and experienced either dishonorable discharge or a lack of benefits and the ability to access services post-discharge, and how that might impact not only their health, but where they believe they can get services. So it might be more difficult to then engage either with the VA or engage with services that are familiar with veterans' needs because of the perception that they are not able to get those services.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And historically too, with prohibitions on covering trans related surgeries, it's definitely, as a trans veteran myself, it's definitely felt that at times, the VA doesn't exist for veterans like myself. So, thankfully things have started to change. They've announced policy changes that have definitely improved, and they're doing a lot of work to outreach and build relationships with our community, but there's still a long way to go. And I think you're very right that just kind of a seeing disenfranchisement in the military settings and then the healthcare settings, you carry that with you coming out, and it does affect your relationship with civilian healthcare and your relationship with willingness to seek care either from a VA or civilian provider as well. Julia.
Yeah, I was just thinking about another layer of just feeling unseen, maybe, or not, not acknowledged, not understood, not recognized. So I love where we can integrate the polling questions, but just in this little select group, our general awareness of the representation of trans and non-binary individuals in having served in the military, we all sort of responded, many of us, that it was a low percentage, and in fact there's an overrepresentation. So I just wonder, it makes me think like there may be also that just lack of knowledge and awareness about that, and the ripples that can create.
Absolutely. I think, especially for folks who served a long time, or who have been recently discharged, where their identity as being a service member is kind of more present in their self-concept generally. I think that when you go to a provider and you don't feel like that's seen or taken into account, it's not the same as having a marginalized identity, definitely, but it does put you into a group where you have unique needs and background that may more closely align with others in that group than those outside of it. So absolutely. Thank you for all those comments. I want to move on next here. If we could hit the slide. I want to move on next here and briefly touch on two issues that are related to veteran health and affect transgender and non-binary veterans disproportionately more than transgender and non-binary civilians and cisgender veterans, which are specifically homelessness and suicide risk. So we know about a third of the general transgender and non-binary population has experienced homelessness in their lifetime, which is a shockingly high percentage in and of itself. We also know, unfortunately, that homelessness among veterans receiving care from the VHA is 3 times higher for transgender and non-binary veterans than for cisgender veterans. Similarly, research suggests that transgender and non-binary veterans may be upwards of 20 times more likely than cisgender veterans to be homeless, who are known already to be at an increased risk from the general population as well too. Because minority veterans, and specifically, I'm talking about veterans who are minorities because of their sexual orientation or gender, racial minorities, and or women are less likely to utilize their VA benefits compared to non-minority peers. So in other words, diverse veterans are less likely to access the benefits that their service entitles them to than are white cisgender men. There is an increasing number of transgender and non-binary veterans who are accessing the VA for health services, and that has come as they've opened up their policies and covered more things for us as well, and increased their competency. However, as non-VA clinics serving transgender and non-binary individuals, you may want to consider screening for veteran status in your intakes for some of the reasons that we've discussed. And you can do this by asking whether an individual is serving or has served in the U.S. military on your intake forms. Increased risks for homelessness and suicide can have implications on access and willingness to receive HIV prevention and care services. Oh, sorry, I think I'm a little bit behind here on the slides for us. If we could go ahead 2 more, I think we'll be caught up there. Perfect, thank you. Increased risk for homelessness and suicide can have implications on access to and willingness to receive HIV prevention and care services. I'm sure you already see the effects of those things in the general transgender and non-binary population that you work with. If someone can't access stable housing, the same or similar factors will likely affect their access to stable healthcare regardless of veteran status. If we could go to the next slide. But for veterans, or for clients or patients who are veterans, I do want to make you aware that there are some really great programs out there that can provide veterans with practical assistance in overcoming both issues. And so there's some links here for you for their homelessness programs where they offer a broad range of services. Generally speaking, they can collaborate with state and local organizations to provide case management, short-term housing, and support veterans in achieving long-term housing and employment goals as well. In terms of suicide prevention resources, there's also some information there on specific crisis telephone lines, information on VA mental health resources and treatments, support for those who may have lost a loved one to suicide, tips for storing potentially lethal items in the home, and more. Those are obviously not exhausted, but they can be a great place to start. Let's see here, where are we on? Let's go ahead and move to the next slide here. We've had a really great discussion going so far, and I'm just curious if that one can kind of be a depressing topic. If there is anything that folks want to share, I would invite you to do so now, either on mute or via chat. Anything that you've learned so far, something that surprised you, or anything that's informed your understanding about the experiences of transgender and non-binary veterans.
Ms. Jai, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how that when we're working with veterans, there might be an assumption around how to support folks in the space. So not making loud noise, all of it related to PTSD, right? So not making loud noises and the assumption of combat PTSD. And this really has me thinking about the necessity of taking the informed consent approach and really recognizing the fact that if sexual violence is high within our community, what it means to access services and how to access services and how we can provide those in a way that is both affirming but also recognizes the sensitivity for how we have these conversations, I think is really important. And then the other thing I was thinking about is that it's interesting to me from a data standpoint, because I feel like a lot of data has come out of the VA around trans and non-binary communities and prevalence within communities. And part of that, I think, is because traditionally there has been a lack of information at a population level. And so it's been really interesting to see how that has resulted in a shift of SOGI data collection and trying to create services, recognizing trans and non-binary service members. And I hope that picks up in other spaces where trans and non-binary people are being served. And then that's the other thought for me is I think of a number of trans and non-binary organizations and programs that are developed to serve trans and non-binary people, but I don't think have information on how to serve veterans. And with so many trans and non-binary people having veteran experience, I think that will be an interesting additional lens to bring into the services that are being provided.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Lisa, your hand is up.
Yeah, Jordan, this was so interesting. I learned so much. This is all very new information to me. And it just made, and kind of just everything that Ms. Jai said, it's like trauma-informed care. And I know that we've talked about that, and I've heard Ty say that a number of times, how important trauma-informed care is, and that just fits right here. And everything Ms. Jai said is actually trauma-informed care as far as how to, because it's so much trauma. And this is so interesting, especially it's so hurtful too, because, I think of people who just want to serve and want to do this work, and kind of fight and die for your country type thing. And then, and then you're treated like that, that is some real trauma, and then, and what I thought about is stories that I heard of just when people come home from, military and from war and that their own country, looks upon them not as heroes, so this was incredible. So I thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And that's kind of actually a perfect segue a bit into the next bit of what we're going to talk about, which is minority stress. And so put simply, the minority stress model is a framework to understand disparities that minority groups face across various social, economic, and health outcomes in society. It theorizes that minorities face unique and hostile stressors related to their identities that have negative effects on their health and mental health. So in this context, there are a lot of opportunities for minority stress associated with being a transgender or non-binary service member. And some include being forced to hide or alter your gender identity or expression, being interrogated about your sexuality, being threatened with outing, etc. In addition to the interpersonal or cultural stressors that may exist for transgender and non-binary veterans, it's also critical to understand the role that recent U.S. military history and policy has played in directly causing harm to individuals' careers and lives, specifically with regards to the transgender ban. And so as we're getting towards the end of today's COP, in considering how to best support transgender and non-binary veterans that you encounter, the recommendations that I have do overlap very heavily with the best practices commonly discussed when we're working with the broader transgender and non-binary community. And so that's things like screening for gender identity in your intake forms, ensuring that you're using people's chosen names and pronouns by everyone in your staff and in your office and in your records, educating yourself on transgender and non-binary health experiences and outcomes. Those are all excellent things to do, and they will continue to, those will pay dividends in improving the quality of services that you can offer specifically for transgender and non-binary veterans and non-veterans alike. So I do have a couple of suggestions to add that are kind of uniquely applicable to transgender and non-binary veterans in particular. And the first one, as I mentioned earlier, is to screen for military service in your intake forms, if doing so makes sense in your organization's context. It may not, but if it does, it's a simple question that, I think we've identified, this group has really done a great job of identifying the trauma that can come from not being just simply not seen. So beyond the direct things that can come from overt transphobic statements or policies directly excluding you based on your identity, it's a lot of feeling like, well, this isn't made for me. Nothing's really made with me in mind. And so screening for military service, like I said, it's a question at most, and it may help inform some aspect of your patient-provider relationship. So, for example, we talked a little bit about some of the services that veterans are eligible for. Additionally, there are disability benefits, life insurance benefits. There are a lot of things that folks may not know that they're eligible for because they didn't have an honorable discharge on their way out or what have you. But, if you find out, if you know that they are a veteran, you might be able to connect them with services that you might not otherwise be able to refer them to. So, for example, if your patient's struggling to afford something like gender-affirming prosthetics or housing, they may not know that those are benefits that they might be able to access through the VA. The VA will actually pay for certain gender-affirming prosthetics and items such as binders, things like that are normally not covered by health insurance. Those things can be made available to veterans through the VA that are accessing the VA healthcare system. And the next thing to do is really to hear our voices and continue learning about our experiences. More and more people are coming out. There's more and more literature out there on us, both research oriented and kind of anecdotally folks sharing their stories with service from all time periods. There have always been trans people in the military. We're not a thing that just popped up in 2015. We've been there for a very long time and at very disproportionately high numbers. So to continue to learn about what our experiences can look like and what resources are out there. Also, I think it's important to understand as well, and this got brought up earlier too, the context for why some transgender and non-binary veterans may be coming to you for services rather than the VA. Even if they do have access to things, unfortunately, there has, as y'all have identified, the VA has not been known for being the gold standard for healthcare for my majority identity veterans. And so for trans and non-binary folks, that can really compound. And so that desire to not put themselves in that sort of situation or in a situation that feels reminiscent of maybe trauma that they experienced in the military, they may be coming to you for services instead. So I think understanding that, especially if it's that case, trans folks often come with a lot of trauma baggage into your offices, and veterans are kind of the same thing. And when you put those identities together, there can be some really deep and unique ways that it's really important for that person to be made to feel safe in your presence and in your office, and really doing anything that you can to make sure that they feel seen is so important. Next slide, please. The last thing I wanted to bring up on that is that I want you to know that there are a couple of organizations that exist out there, just kind of to know and refer people to as relevant. The first one is the Minority Veterans of America. I had the privilege of serving on their board for a couple of years. It's a wonderful organization. They exist for more than just transgender and non-binary veterans, but there's a large presence of trans and non-binary vets within MVA, as well as a lot of racial minority vets. And it's a really, just from personal experience, it's a really amazing place to really be able to bring your whole self, where you're not segregated out by being, trans, veteran, check all these boxes until you have this tiny little community. It's a place where even though our struggles are maybe different, the experience of being a non-majority identity veteran tend to have a lot of things in common, and it's a really great community. And they also provide a lot of practical assistance and resources for folks as well. And then the next one I wanted to bring up is the Transgender American Veterans Association, or TAVA. That's another organization that supports transgender and non-binary veterans by connecting them with specific resources and community and advocacy that's fluid in meeting their unique needs. So, I think, let's see, next slide. Oh, sorry, next one. I think that one actually got a little bit out of order. That was our intake forms one. So next. Perfect, thank you. So
Jordan, we have a comment in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Go back a couple PowerPoints. The question from Ms. Jai was, what was the name of the organization? And I think you're referring to TAVA, Ms.
Yes, MVA is Minority Veterans of America. That's the non-trans specific one. And then the Transgender American Veterans Association is, as the name implies, trans specific. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, I'll just open up the floor for any final questions or comments that folks have about any of the material that we've discussed today. I know it's a lot.
We have, so go ahead, Stuart, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just curious, with the awareness around transgendered health and well-beingness, do you think that the media is still, what's the pulse on the hesitation for media to support the awareness around this that would reduce stigma and all the barriers to care for veterans, specifically to this topic? I was curious about. I know that's kind of an overarching question, but focused around media.
If you could reframe your question, I think it's hard to understand. What are you asking?
So let me just, thank you, Ty. So I guess the general public, with the influence of media, when we want to talk about awareness so that we can reduce stigma specific to veterans, what is the pulse of that today? Like with LGBTQ, BIPOC communities, I feel like there's an awareness around that where there's movement. What is the pulse on that with transgendered health? Is that better question?
I think so. So I think you're asking, let me know if I'm misunderstanding this, but it sounds like you're asking kind of what's the state of the union, so to speak, on transgender veteran media representation.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's come a long ways. I mean, speaking for myself, I served from 2011 to 2015. So for anybody who's as much of a super nerd as I am and knows when the trans ban was under the original one prior to it getting rescinded and then re-implemented. So I served under kind of the first wave of we weren't talked about, we weren't allowed to exist. So I've seen about 9 years, 10 years of this, of our media representation, and it's improved. I mean, I think that overall, there was definitely some smart strategy on behalf of those organizing to allow open transgender service on kind of the active duty side. There was definitely some very smart media strategy, training folks to do media appearances, and really speak to the narrative that we're here, we're as fit to serve as anyone else, and this should not be a thing that prevents that. And honestly, I think that message really was successful, because when I was contemplating coming out in 2013-ish, it was a different ballpark. It was a very different landscape. There weren't a lot of reasons to be hopeful, but I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but there is data out there on like what the US thought about open trans service circa 2014 versus 2022, and it skyrocketed. Kind of similarly to how America turned around very quickly on the idea of same-sex marriage, so to speak, in terms of social movements. This one was pretty quick. I think it's because I don't think there was a deeply held desire to not allow trans people to serve. I think it was kind of a surface level bigotry, but when people continue saying, we're here, we've been here forever, we just want to do our jobs, I think that message was really effective. And so, again, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it is really remarkable how much public opinion was swayed over the last 5 to 10 years. So
thank you so much. Ms. Jai, over to you.
I'm thinking a lot. There's two things from this that are really sticking with me. The first was one of your first comments, that the military is the largest employer of trans and non-binary people. Which really, as soon as you said it, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, but it still really struck me because I don't think I've ever conceptualized the military as an employer in that way. And so it also has me thinking a lot about how a lot of our own biases in the work that we're doing, I came up working in LGBT organizations, and a lot of my own biases around military service, around veterans, around the assumption of conservativeness, like all of these pieces, I feel like there's still a lot of work we need to do within our organizations in order to sort of unwind some of those biases in order to better serve veterans, because I think some of those biases are present in our services.
I absolutely agree. I think it's so important to understand why trans service was such a big deal. I know folks have a wide range of opinions on the U.S. military, and it can sometimes be difficult to realize, regardless of those opinions, that yes, this is the largest employer. So what in the world? So what they do with their policy, if they have a policy saying you cannot be this, that matters. And that has serious implications for the civilian system as well. And I think one thing I wanted to mention as well with this is, so we know trans people serve at least twice the rate of the general population, and I think that begs the question a little bit of why. And we don't have a complete picture of why, but I think there are two things that I want to pull out. And the first would be, it affords you an opportunity to do gender in a different way. And so for folks who are on the trans masculine side of the spectrum, it's a place where being more masculine isn't discouraged. I was a place where I was called by my rank and my last name, and that alleviated gender dysphoria that I didn't know I even had until all of a sudden I wasn't getting called by my birth name anymore. And for trans feminine people, a lot of times what they'll say is, I was picked on for being a sissy growing up, and I wanted to prove that I was a man, and you can't tell me I'm not a man if I'm a Marine. And so, there's a lot of reasons that drive people into this. And then the second one, and this probably being the more important one, I think is economic. And I know y'all have been through a lot of these presentations. I know you're familiar with a lot of the data on why and how trans people are so severely economically disenfranchised. And I know as well that generally speaking applies to racial groups as well. And so when you throw those things on, you often end up with people who have very little economic prospect to really better themselves and or to get out of a situation that may be homophobic or transphobic and keeping them in a closet. And the military really offers opportunities that you may not otherwise get. That's why I enlisted. I didn't enlist because I, gung-ho America or whatever. I wanted to go to college. That was the only way that I could afford to go to college. And so, I think understand. Yeah, I'll just say, Ms. Jai, absolutely. I think that there is a stereotype of veterans that people are conservative and yada yada. But the reality is, especially for many of us who are transgender, non-binary veterans, it's a lot of folks who are there because they were in some form of poverty and or some form of bad interpersonal situation and wanted to get out. And I think recognizing some of those drivers is critically important in understanding how to serve our communities, especially with this level of overrepresentation.
Thank you. And Julia, you have our final comment.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jordan, for your really skilled presentation, your knowledge on this subject, ability to facilitate the conversation, and for your service. And just, this is much more of a general comment, but I can't help but think about, Stuart asked something about media, and Jordan, you said something about fitness of serve, and it just is striking to me to think about all the ways, all the places, and this is one example where there's such focus or concern or outrage or discourse on fitness around whatever, and yet at our kind of highest level of leadership in our government, in our country, there's not such screening in place. It's just kind of striking me right now.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all so much for participating and commenting today. It was a really awesome discussion, and I'm so glad we were able to have it. With that, I know we're at time, so Zami, if you have any final announcements or anything, I'll let you close that out.
Thank you so much. Let's give Jordan a virtual round of applause for bringing us home for our last COP. I just want to take a moment to say thank you all again for your consistency, and also thank you for your dedication to gender-affirming care, ending the HIV epidemic, and really showing up for providing services for transgender, non-binary folks and all other folks whose identities are often marginalized. We hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Thank you again, and we will see you next time.
Zami, everybody, thank you.